Hello everyone, Leafreed here, and today we have The Art of War by Sun Tzu. This is kind of a meme book, as I have discovered, well, first of all, it's not very long. In fact, I think a lot of people actually have read this book, but maybe not exactly taken its themes to heart, but they definitely have read it. And I was actually really surprised. This book is roughly 200 pages long, but the first 30 pages are forewords and introductions and prefaces and all that stuff. And the last 50 pages are appendices and names and places and how to pronounce things. And so you can see the size of the font there. So it's really not a long book. I read this in an afternoon and surprised myself. I was like kind of getting through it, but around page 150, I just finished it. But yeah. So The Art of War, pretty good book. What's nice about it, and I see why people like it, it's based upon generalities. It's very much focused towards men, not only in the fact that it's about warfare and functional aspects of warfare, but there's no romance, there's no character development. It's very kind of punctual, formal, and I actually really like that. It's very much point form. Like, it does get to the point because it just it has bullet points of aspect 25 of fighting a greater enemy, greater force combat. What do you do? And so again, there are things where it deals with specifics and generalities. Everything from if you're going to go on a 30-mile trek to the army provisions, what's the least amount of time you should use to prepare, and how much should you pay the wagoners and stuff like that, and all that stuff that's pretty much obsolete. But it's the bigger ideas that I think are still in play and intact. And even though I think some people might read this and kind of oversimplify and bastardize it, hopefully I can give some new light into exactly what these terms mean. What's actually really funny is how the book starts, where here's a picture of the battle tactics, and Sun Tzu is actually training a bunch of women in the art of war as this gamble or something to the emperor, who basically says, well, if you can teach my concubines and my harem how to fight, then surely you can teach my men. It's something like that. It's not exactly clear. And it doesn't go into the biography of Sun Tzu that he was a military commander, and that when this first was released, it was called his military pamphlet or whatever. It's something very formal, and then it became The Art of War later on. And so he essentially, did fight in real battles, and then this is around 500 BC in China, and so so he was a real military guy. These were his commandments, his teachings, and he kind of combined. What's really nice about it is he combines the practical military day-to-day operations with philosophy. Probably my favorite line in this whole book is how he compares an army to water. That water will flow and it will fill empty spaces. And then, you always want to have the most advantage point at a high and sunny place, and you want to have the water flow into the weaknesses of the enemy. And so that's a really cool visual design that you can imagine. And if you look at the spreading of empires in the ancient world, those kind of maps where it changes colors, and you have the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Sumerians and stuff, and one empire takes over another, it does look very much like the flow of water, or the flow of something. And I just think that's a really cool metaphor, because it does fit in what we see throughout history. So anyway, on this story about teaching these women, it's really interesting that and again, before we get there, because I was talking to someone else about this, and they say that this book is actually recommended to a lot of business leaders. So it's not only military applications, but business applications, and any application in which you are dealing with commanding a large group or being a manager. Maybe you're the head of a large household, maybe. What is this is not good for is, I know I saw some video after the fact about some guy trying to use Art of War to enhance his FPS gameplay experience, which yeah, like maybe there's some aspects, but it's really about being a commander-in-chief. So I would say, like in the video game world, this would be good for like an RTS game, obviously, not an FPS. But anyway, I digress. So it is funny to keep in the back of your mind, though, that all the context of these lessons could also be applied to like business and whatnot. So the first story about teaching these women is that, of course, he makes this bet with the emperor, and so he takes his 2 head concubines and he makes them the dual commanders, and he goes over, how an army is divided. And so he basically says here, in this image, let me get it. So basically, he's just doing typical instructions. And so he gives all the women these spears, and he says, okay, there's forward position, left, right, and then back, where you kind of take a step back and whatever. And so he basically says to the 2 head concubines, okay, you have to train them. When you say forward, they all go forward. When they all go left, they go left. When they go right, they go right. So just very basic exercises. And so what occurs is that these 2 women are unable to command the army. And all the women end up kind of laughing and joking, saying, oh, we can't wield these spears, obviously. We're not going to go into battle. It's ridiculous. And so Sun Tzu's, reaction to this is that if instructions are unclear and you can't get an army to operate in a training environment with no external forces, then it is not the cause or the fault of the soldiers, it's the fault of the commanders. The commanders are not proper and they're not organized. And so what I think happens as a point, or like in real combat, he actually executes the 2 head concubines. He beheads them for their failure to command the troops, and that kind of puts them in line, and then they will now follow orders, and the next commanders will know their life is on the line. It says he actually did this, but and there was some weird thing where the emperor was like, those are my 2 favorite concubines, don't do that. But he does it anyway. Again, I'm not super clear on exactly the details there, but the moral and the message is still there, that if in business or whatever, if you are unclear on instructions so that you can't perform your duty or your job, that is your manager's fault, because they didn't give you proper instructions. I know, just something I thought of. And so then it kind of delves into the book itself. Ooh, there's a nice map. I love maps in my books. That's always fun. It's a map of China, basically, the different kingdoms of that time. Oh, and so finally the book actually opens up on page 63. So there's even it's only about 100 pages, which is very, very short. So it's supposed to be an actual, military manual, really. So like about half this book is just notes about the thing itself. And so when we finally launch into the text, what do we get? There are 5 factors to running an army, essentially. One, that is moral influence. The second is earth. The third is heaven. The fourth is command. And the 5th is doctrine. And so it kind of goes into what does that mean. And I also really like how this is written, where it's kind of given, again, a point form. So it's like each one is a different point. What's also nice is that it's in the form of almost like a conversation. So you'll have other Chinese generals who will speak up and either clarify or give context to what Sun Tzu means. So what do you mean by moral law? As part of the one of the doctrines. By moral influence, I mean that which causes people to be in harmony with their leaders, so that they will accompany them in life and onto death without fear or peril. When one treats, and then Cheng Yu, jumps in and says, when one treats people with benevolence, justice, and righteousness, and presupposes confidence in them, the army will be united in mind and will always be happy to serve their leaders. The Book of Changes says, in happiness at overcoming difficulties, people forget the dangers of death. So, essentially, that's a really good point at the end there, where every time you are faced with a big problem or a situation, you always want to characterize it as overcoming a great obstacle together. You don't want to say, oh, we missed our quota, or we're going to hit it next quarter or something. You can say, look, our work is cut out for us, but I have confidence and belief in our team that we're going to push through and make it in the business world. That's how I would say. So you always want to characterize obstacles and problems as things they're going to get through together, and we're hopeful to overcome, essentially. And so that basically motivates everyone, and unifies them. When he talks about earth, he's talking actually about the terrain, and when he's talking about heaven, he's talking about the weather. And so basically, the terrain of the earth is how the troops move along. The terrain, they know how fast they can move, how swiftly they can move, if there's water or rivers to ford through. And speaking of weather, I think I'm getting rained on. Sorry about that, I was getting rained on, so I should have moved to a superior position, as Mr. Sun Tzu would say. So heaven is, the weather, the sun, the rain, things like that. And here Sun Tzu says the best place to encamp your troops is essentially in a high and sunny place. And he does actually say the sun not only makes the men feel good, but it also makes diseases stay away because you're getting your vitamin D. And so again with the terrain, you can then know if you can use cavalry or shock troops or whatever, and exactly how fast and if they will be impeded or not in their advance. By command, he means the general's actual attributes. So, the way you command your army, he says the one thing that you want your general to be is respected. Doesn't matter if he's feared or loved, but as long as he is respected, then you are basically good to go. If the troops don't respect their commander, then there will be disorder and chaos, essentially. And finally, you have doctrine, which is the last point, which is just kind of the practical application of the army itself. So everything from your provisions to the order of troops, generals, officers, your banners, your symbols, everything that you're actually using is kind of the last piece. So all of your practical applications, really. And he says the ideal mode that you want to have your troops in is that when you sound the attack, they are happy to do so. And when you kind of sound the gongs for retirement, then they are dismayed, for they want to engage in battle with you. And it's actually funny because I was watching something by, I think even Jocko Willink, who said that, it surprised him that when they got there, he was like in some platoon or some squad or something, some Navy SEALs thing. And when they got their new commander, this guy was like, they all liked him. And by liking him, they were able to actually, they wanted to do things for him, and they wanted to be able to follow his orders because they wanted his respect and his appraisal. And it's interesting in here as well that one of the things that Sun Tzu says is a general should be like a father to his children for his soldiers. And so he definitely wants to be like a parent kind of figure, but it's interesting that he also contrasts that with, there are also 5 bad aspects to being a general. One of them being overly compassionate or avaricious or scared of losing life. So if you're scared to even lose a single man, then you're not going to be able to conquer anything. And so, you kind of want to treat them as your children and, kind of have that father-like figure where they want to kind of prove themselves to you. But you also can't be overly compassionate and not want them to lose a single man, like a single child, because you have to realize that that is the inevitability of war. And there it is, number 17. All warfare is based on deception. So then he goes on to talk about, the different kinds of deceptions where, when you are strong, appear weak. When you are weak, appear strong. Always attack the enemy where he least expects it. Always move to where the enemy least expects you. He kind of says in the shifting of the formations of an army, it will always have a strong front, and you always want to attack or find its weak front and destroy it there. And so they're just, every time that the enemy expects you to do something unexpected, which also comes into his other biggest quote, which is that if you know yourself and you know your enemy, you should not fear the outcome of 1,000 battles. And so by working on deception, you basically will make the enemy not be able to anticipate where you're going to be, how strong you're going to be, and what you're going to do. So if your enemy does not know you and does not know what you want or who you are or how you operate, then that gives you the upper hand of the battle every time. And if you know what they're going to do in response, then again, you can just win, basically. And he says at all times, if you can, anger the enemy general. Try to find ways to insult him or bait him, anger and confuse him, insult and enrage him so that he will be irritated and confused and will act brashly and will basically openly attack without thinking about it. So he'll rush into battle and he'll deploy his troops immediately. And so if he falls for the bait of you aggravating him, there's actually a really funny story that I want to find in here. You know, if so we basically just do the one thing that your enemy doesn't want to happen. So if he's at rest, make him move. If he is, moving, then make him stop. You know, whatever you need to do, just do the thing that he doesn't expect or does not want to happen. When he's united, divide him. And this actually goes into certain tactics that are really interesting about larger and smaller forces. And it's really interesting how he defines it, where managing a larger force versus a smaller force isn't exactly the management of it is more or less the same, he says. Mostly the same. There are some exceptions, but if you're managing a huge army or a small army, it doesn't matter. The rules of engagement, or rather the rules of organization, are the same. But the rules of engagement do change. Obviously, if you were a smaller force or a larger force, there are different ways to come out on top, and the size of the army actually doesn't really matter. So if you are facing an opponent where you massively overwhelm them, 10-1, let's say, then you surround them. If you have 5-1, you attack them directly with just overwhelming force and find their weak spot. If it's 2-1, then you find a way to basically divide their army and make them, go off and attack that smaller front. If it's on one-on-one, then you need to find like a different strategy to find their weak point. And if you have a much smaller force over an overwhelming enemy, what you do is you draw them out and you basically make them also divide themselves, and then you basically probe them and find their weak point and then attack there, essentially. And so this is interesting what he says about, victory is the main objective in war. And, the highest art of warfare is to win without fighting. And so, if your attack is long delayed, if, your war is, lacking the swiftness of decisiveness, then it will essentially fail. And he says, no country in the history of the world has benefited from a prolonged confrontation. You kind of need to end it then and there. And to drag it out will only drain your resources, your treasury, and your provisions and supply lines, and will basically guarantee that even if you win, you will have dwindled everything in the length of time it took to take that, and it will not be worth it. Yeah, if war, and Li Chuan chimes in here, and he says, if war drags on without cessation, men and women will resent not being able to marry and will be distressed by the burdens of transportation. So there's another reason why you don't drag out war. Here's another what's also really nice about this book, again, is that they have little anecdotes about some of the tactics that were used. So there's these two armies, and usually what happens in these scenarios is that one army or one town is surrounded and how the other army reacts to it. And so basically this one army that was surrounded, they were worried that the enemy army would come out and basically desecrate the graves of their ancestors, which they did. And so the general waited until they actually did that, and they actually enraged the populace. And then once the populace was enraged, then he sounded the attack for it. The reason being is that, somewhere in here, but he basically said, when men are essentially ready to fight and die when they are enraged, and they are 10 times more likely to fight as lions than lambs, essentially, in the event that they are enraged. And he says, other things here, treat captives well, care for them, and so you can turn them over to your side eventually. This is called winning a battle and becoming stronger. It is essential in war that victory is not prolonged in operations, and therefore the general who understands war is the minister of the people's fate and the arbiter of the nation's destiny. Again, you want to leave a state intact instead of ruin it, so that the state, he says, the treasury can be emptied and kind of divided amongst, the spoils can be divided amongst, the soldiers and the other participants. But what the state really wants is the land and the people and the industry within it, and that really hasn't seemed to change. To capture an enemy's army is better then destroying it. And again, here it is, to win 100 victories and 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill. And basically what is of supreme importance in war is to attack the enemy's strategy. And I think this is where this book really comes in. It's where whatever the enemy is planning, aside from taking out the head of the army and the head of the military so that they can't organize, what's even better is to take out their ideas. So if the enemy has this massive idea that they're going to lure you into this valley and blow up this dam and flood everyone, then if you know what their plan is, you can basically either, not go into the valley or attack the dam yourself or seize the dam, and therefore you've taken away the idea and the plan of the enemy. So if you know what the enemy is thinking and you know what his strategy is and you attack that directly, that's the highest art of warfare, where he realizes they don't have an advantage anymore, and basically that confounds them. And so again, it's really two generals fighting each other mentally over, what is he going to do? And so that's really, really interesting. And there's something somewhere in here also, just, to defeat your enemy without fighting. There's something where it says it's like a demoralized and disorganized army awaits his enemy's victory. So if you can demoralize and disorganize an army, they will just be totally ineffective. Here's another story where this was really interesting. So they sent a counselor, what was his name? Huang Fu Wen was Chun's heart and guts counselor. And so he was basically sent there to basically negotiate after they had been surrounded. He was extremely arrogant, and usually the ambassadors are, unharmed, but the general, Kohos Husun, basically said he knew that that the ambassador was actually the heart and guts of the operation. And so when he actually killed him in the negotiating room, after he was apparently rude to him, the king surrendered because he didn't have a plan. And I don't know, that was just really interesting. Oh, I found it. This is my favorite thing on enraging the enemy and baiting them into attack. So there was Emperor Wu, who had 100,000 troops attack General Seng Qi at Yutai. And so the emperor basically, who had, the advantage, he had all these troops and had surrounded the city, he basically asked, the general, why didn't you send over a bottle of wine to celebrate my victory? So he's kind of baiting him. But then what happens is the general sends him a pot of sealed urine instead. And so this aggravates Emperor Wu so greatly, and he's so peeved by it, that he orders an immediate assault, which they're waiting for. And by the end of the assault, they had slaughtered about half his army, while they hadn't taken the city at all. Oh, he says, whenever you have a weaker force, always make sure you're capable of withdrawing. You don't want to get surrounded. That's the one thing you don't want. He also says, interestingly enough, that in most cases, not every case, but in most cases, when an enemy is surrounded, you actually want to give them an avenue of escape, because he says that if the enemy believes that there is a hope or a chance of not dying, they will always take that route, even if it routs them and they end up dying anyway. But if you completely surround an enemy, then they shall fight 10 times as fiercely, because when they realize there is no hope, they will fight to the death and be as fierce as a tiger, essentially. And so he's basically saying, when you have a smaller force, you have to either, have a route of escape, or even better, guerrilla warfare tactics, in which case you always are constantly never even seen by the enemy, which is the best way to attack a large force, which is similar to, the U.S. invasion of Vietnam, I suppose, and Afghanistan. But unless the enemy is super, super, super small, then you want to basically surround them. And so this is interesting. He goes into the 3 ways that a ruler can bring misfortune to his army. One is that he is ignorant at the times to advance and the times to retreat, and they are not in sync with what the army feels that they should do. The second one is obviously when he is ignorant of military affairs and he doesn't know what he's doing at all. And the third one, which I think is very relevant even to today, is when he is essentially complacent or subordinate to a sovereign. And there's a whole chapter in here where it talks about essentially the issues with the king or the emperor running the army who isn't even there, and how this chain of command, when someone it basically comes and interferes with your work and how you're running things, that can basically spell misfortune, and sometimes you have to disobey what your king says or emperor. It's just funny. Circumstances is when, the son or the offspring of His Majesty, on account of his name, make him commander-in-chief. This is like gluing the pegs of a lute and then trying to tune it. So you're just adding on something that just doesn't belong there and then trying to make someone who, again, has no business in military matters in charge of it, and it fails, obviously. And so then he goes into the 5 circumstances in which, when you know that you can have victory, or that will ascertain victory. One is you can know when to fight. How a commander can use both a large and small forces. Someone whose ranks are united in purpose, that they're all on the same page. He who is prudent and patient when to attack, and also that the generals are free to act without outside interference from sovereigns or other elements. Yeah, to put a rein on an able general while at the same time asking him to suppress a cunning enemy is like tying up a black hound and then ordering him to catch elusive hares. So you just want him to be free and don't give him a bunch of red tape, essentially. Yeah. And then there it is, at the end of this chapter. Know the enemy, know yourself. In 100 battles, you will never be in peril. And then he goes on to talk about attacking and defending. He says, it's funny, actually, I love this. He ascribes elements to them. In defense, you want to be like earth. You want to be subdued in the earth, confined in what he calls the 9-layer earth, the 9-fold earth, and basically be concealed and as a rock and a stone. But when you attack, you should be actually as a lightning bolt. And I find that very interesting. That's literally a blitzkrieg, that when you attack, it should be as a lightning bolt. It should be fast, swift, decisive, and total. Yeah, release the attack like a lightning bolt above the 9-layered heavens. And when you are in defense, you should be as the mountains, rivers, and foothills. They make it impossible for the enemy to know where to attack. So not only are you hidden, but you're also fortified. And so then he goes into, the construction of an army. You have a single soldier, then his partner, and then his squad, his platoon, his brigade, etc., until you have the company and then the army. And so the administration of one of these units is not really that different from the administration of all of these units. As long as people know who they report to, where to take orders, they know how to follow banners, gongs, they're given clear instructions, and the administration of this workforce essentially is in unison, then that is, perfect. And again, that applies to the principle of doctrine, that everything is in order and everyone knows what they're doing and how they respond and whatnot, and etc. And he says when you attack, there's only 2 types of attack. There is normal attack and overwhelming attack. And so normal attack might be used to draw out the enemy, kind of defeat them, here and there, and draw out their weak point. And then overwhelming attack is when you send in all of your troops at once. And that very much, I think, resonates with RTS games. I can definitely see that. This is interesting. I like this. And this is definitely true in the workforce. Therefore, a skilled commander seeks victory from the situation and does not demand it of his subordinates. And so, you don't ask someone to do something that they're incapable of doing, but he places people in positions that allows the situation of victory to come about from his placement. And also, you want to fit each role to each proper character or individual. This is actually Cheng Yu saying, now the method of employing men is to use the avaricious and the stupid, the wise and the brave, and to give responsibility to each in situations that suit him. Do not charge people to do what they cannot do. Select them and give them responsibilities commensurate with their nature and their abilities. So that just reminds me of certain people who get hired or put in the wrong positions that cannot do what is asked of them, and that, in which case that is the fault of the commander or employer, essentially. You also have other interesting things about, the actual reading the troops, trying to figure out what the enemy is like. If the soldiers are leaning on their weapons, on their spears, it means they're fatigued, tired, and probably hungry. If you see the soldiers whispering a lot amongst each other, it means they've lost faith in their command and their commander. And if you hear the enemy troops at night very boisterous and very loud before the battle has been won, as if they're celebrating, that means that they're very, very scared and uncertain, and they're trying to keep that fear away with the noise. And so he says, yeah, there's never a moment where an enemy is impenetrable. If he prepares to the front, his rear will be weak. If to the rear, his front will be fragile. If he prepares to the left, then to the right, and if to the right, then to the left. And when he prepares everywhere, he will be weak everywhere. I like this one because he kept talking about troop movements over terrain, and what confuse him with where you are and how you're going to be. And here's a really funny one that I didn't even think of doing. Turn misfortune to his advantage. When he deceives the fool and fools the enemy into making him dilatory and lax, and then marches on speedily. So basically, at certain points, you make your army appear as if they're fatigued and slow, and then suddenly you make them speed up and march at twice speed in order to confuse the enemy as to exactly, what your position is, and also what your disposition is. Again, what is also very high is the discipline of the army. So there is one guy who was in charge of armor when Wu Qi fought against Qin. There was an officer before a battle control his armor, so he went in when he saw the enemy was weak without his orders, and he defeated that force and brought back one of the leader's heads. And for that he himself was decapitated because actually it says it right here. The army commissioner admonishing him said, "This is a talented officer, you should not behead him." And Wu Qi replied, "I am confident that he is an officer of talent, but he is disobedient." And thereupon he beheaded him. So you have to respect the chain of command. Essentially, that is once the chain of command falls, then there is no army. There are just bandits. He says also in terms of terrain, be wary of terrain where he says there's only a few different types of terrain. Terrain where it's easy to take, terrain it's easy to take but difficult to retreat from, and terrain in which it's kind of like a dead zone. Like there's no benefit to taking it, in which case you usually leave that terrain alone. You never advance on it. And this is interesting. He talks about how to defeat an enemy or bewilder him, in ways of non-violence. Send his virtuous men away and his allies, so that he will have no counselors. Send treacherous people into his country to wreck his administration. Use cunning deceptions to alienate his ministers from the king. Send skilled craftsmen to encourage his people to exhaust their wealth. Present him with licentious musicians and dancers to change his customs, or give him beautiful women to bewilder him. And he says these are the 5 worst qualities of a bad general. And so you might think of these again as 5 worst qualities of an employer. While a general must be courageous in order to act, in the moment, he cannot be stupid. And so if he's stupid, he will not know when is the right time to act, or will attack early and arrogantly. He cannot be hesitant. If he is too afraid of the enemy and he hesitates at the prime moment, then also he is a bad general. If he is quick-tempered and easy to anger, he is a bad general. If he has too much of a sense of honor and pride that stop him from doing, the slaughtering of the enemy, that will also be bad. And finally, if he is too compassionate and too humanitarian, that will stop him from seizing victory. This is actually another good point about when to attack an enemy. Another example of when they're divided is that if you ever see an enemy crossing a bridge or waterway or some kind of area, wait for them exactly to get halfway, and then you attack their forces, so that they're basically divided on one side and the other side. So don't attack them too early, but don't attack them too late. But once they're evenly divided across the bridge or the river or whatever it is, that's when you strike, when they're equally divided. Oh, I love this. I love this story. So basically, Tian Tan was defending Qimo, the Yan general, and Xie Che surrounded it. So you have Tian Tan and Xie Che. And so Tan was so genius. So he knows he's in a weak position. He's surrounded. And so what he does is he basically schmoozes up, General Che. And so what he does is, what is it? He sends out concubines, he sends out food, he asks, he asks the women in the city walls to ask for terms of surrender. He's saying, we're so weak, we're so scared, please have mercy on us. He starts offering 24,000 ounces of gold, made for his descendants with the letter Qian said. And he said to General Yan, the city is to be surrendered immediately. Our only wish is that you will not make our wives and concubines prisoners. The Yan army became increasingly relaxed and negligent, and Tian Tan sallied out of the city and inflicted a crushing defeat on them. So he basically schmoozed them up, saying, oh, okay, you won. And then immediately, as soon as they let their guard down and relax and think they wouldn't have to battle, Tan comes out and completely eviscerates them. This is another thing that's important. If the enemy comes to you before either side has a clear advantage and he's asking for truce, that means he's plotting something. When the birds gather above the campsites, they're usually empty, out of food. Also, be wary of an enemy when they have not yet engaged you in battle and they are in high spirits. It means there is probably a trap lying in wait for you. This is interesting. In war, numbers alone confer no advantage. Do not advance relying on sheer military power. It's really about outsmarting your enemy. And, a weak force can overtake a large force. Other conditions being equal, if a force attacks one 10 times its size, the result is flight. And it's true, if you have a massive force that is being attacked directly by something like a tenth its size, they get scared and run because they think there's no way they would attack us. But if you do, they will flee, essentially. And I forget what it was from TF2. If you are promised victory, then you must, through fighting, then you must fight. Sun Tzu said that. Except I actually didn't find that in this book. But here's the closest thing to what soldiers said. If the situation is one of victory, but the sovereign has issued orders not to engage, the general may decide to fight. If the situation is such that he cannot win, but the sovereign has issued orders to engage, he need not do so. So again, you kind of have to not listen to your sovereign. Because the general regards his men as infants, they will march with him into the deepest valleys. He treats them as his own beloved children, and they will die with him. And there are other elements here where the general, comes down and, here it is. Again, Chang Yu says, the general must be in the first of the toils and fatigues of the army. In the heat of summer, he does not spread his parasol, nor in the cold of winter does he don thick clothing. And, he dismounts his horse and he walks with his troops. And one real-life example I can think of that is Alexander the Great, when they're crossing this horrific desert back from their conquests into Asia. They basically, all the soldiers gather up this, water, all the water they could find, into, the helmet for Alexander to drink so that he may at least live. And he takes it and he spills it out in front of all the troops, symbolizing that I'm not going to take this, that we're all in this together. And so here's an interesting thing. So we all know the famous line, know thy enemy, know thyself, and, fight 1,000 battles and you shall never lose. But here's an extended version of it. Know the enemy, know yourself, your victories will never be endangered. Know the ground, know the weather, and your victory will be total. So along with knowing, your foe, but also the conditions of the battlefield, that is even better. This is General Meng. Lay on many deceptive operations. Be seen in the west and marched out of the east. Lure him into the north and strike in the south. Drive him crazy and bewilder him so that he disperses his forces in confusion. Oh, this is a good one. Let's say that I don't have the upper hand and the other general does. How do I cope with a well-ordered enemy host who attacks me? And Sun Tzu replied, see something he cherishes, and he will conform to your desires. Such troops need no encouragement to be vigilant. Without extorting their support, the general obtains it. Without inviting their affection, he gains it. Without demanding their trust, he wins it. Now this is interesting. When officers and men care only for worldly riches, they will cherish life at all costs. So if you are mercenaries and you're just fighting for money, you will actually fight as to stay alive and not actually die. So if you have a higher purpose that you're fighting for, then that's a way to encourage your troops. And the other way is that to make them pretend or seem as if you are surrounded, so they will fight ferociously as tigers. And then he talks about, prohibit talks of omen and the supernatural portents, rid your plans of doubt and uncertainties. And the battle must basically first be won in the mind and then on the battlefield. And then it talks about, the different tactics to use fire, the different styles to use, wagons. And then it's really interesting. It finally ends on the last part. I mean, we talked about deception, but the very last chapter, chapter 13 here, is about spies and secret agents. And, double agents are very common. Once you find an agent who is spying on you, you basically bribe them extra and double so that they can now spy on the person and give false reports back to their sovereign. And it talks about deliberately giving false information, so misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. These are all things like in this book, And he finally finishes the book with, an army without secret agents is like an army, is like a man without eyes or ears. And that's it. It was kind of surprising. The book just kind of ends there on chapter 13 about secret agents. And it doesn't say, oh, thank you for reading, Art of War. Here's what we learned. No, it just ends there. So, yeah, really interesting book. Pretty neat. Definitely some good tips, again, that apply to management structures, I guess, RTS scenarios, and just, general good life advice, I would say. I feel it's funny, though, that, again, this book is read by a lot of people because it's so short, and their interpretations of it I find somewhat comical, where it's like, oh, if you're a young man and you need to get typical general life advice, you should read this book. It's like, well, not really. This is like a book for managers. It's a book for obviously real, military generals. I suppose if you're the head of a large household, essentially when you have a lot of people under you and reporting to you. It's not really for one-on-one confrontations. It's really used for an organizational structure. And, there's a lot of funny scenarios here that you can apply to real life and business, where people and managers are not clear on instructions and they're, acting in irrational ways. And it is applicable in that context. But yeah, this is actually a really great book. I would absolutely read it. It's super, super short. I read it in like an afternoon. I was surprised myself, but how fast I got through it. And it's just one of those kind of meme books that everyone just kind of reads at one point in their life. And, is it a lot of generalizations and platitudes? Yes, but there are some applications that I think are very useful in that. And, yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. It's a pretty nice book. It was fun to read. And, yeah, that's it. Yeah, that's Sun Tzu. Anyway, guys, I will see you later. And as always, keep reading. Bye.